So, Miss Grundy liked to get up early in the morning to go over to the school, don't you see? So, they provided her with a mule. This mule's name was Will, and that was short for Strong Will, because he had a strong will. Yes, sir, Will was stubborn. Stubborn as a mule. You've heard that, right? Well, he was. He was stubborn. So, Miss Grundy decided that she was going to be more stubborn. She was going to be the one that conquered this mule, don't you see? And so, you have to understand, if a mule don't want to go nowhere, ain't no hurricane, ain't no tornado that can get it to move. Right? So, Miss Grundy actually thought she had a right nice mule at first, because Will would do just about whatever she wanted. As long as you wanted to go the same direction Will wanted to go, he didn't give you no trouble. And most of the time, he didn't have no opinion about which way to go. But if he didn't want to go, you couldn't shove him, you couldn't push him, you couldn't kick him, you couldn't pull him, you couldn't do nothing to get him to go that way. Well, Miss Grundy's first problem every day was to get a saddle on him so she could ride him to school. So she'd get up in the morning. Now, let's say she was at a house where there was actually a barn, which wasn't very often because this was a brand new village. But if they had a barn, it was really easy. She would just go into the stall, put his stuff on him, ride out. But most places didn't have a barn. All they had was a pasture, and there was a fence around it. And now Will wore a little harnessy thing on his head, and Miss Grundy would get her little lead rope, don't you see, and she'd walk up to him with her lead rope, kind of sneaking up, don't you see, trying to get him to not run away. But Will didn't want to be caught. But he was wily. He wasn't just stubborn, he was wily. So he would stand in the field, calmly chomping on his grass. And then Miss Grundy would get close with the rope, don't you see? And he would run off. He would kick up his heels. He would bray as loud as he could. Hee-haw, hee-haw, hee-haw. Just like he was laughing at her. And he'd run zigzagging around the field. And Miss Grundy would run after him, trying to catch him. And she couldn't. And then he'd stop. And he'd put his head down. And he'd have some more grass. And that would go on 4 or 5 times, don't you know? And then he'd get tired of that. So he'd flop down in the dirt and he'd roll around and get himself all dirty. And then he'd stand upright and look at Miss Grundy like this. Well, Miss Grundy was pretty frustrated, don't you know? Because that mule didn't want to be caught. But after a while, he'd get tired of all of that. So she'd catch him. She'd drag him over to the fence. And at the fence, she would tie him to the fence. Now, the next step was she had to put on a saddle blanket, don't you see? Now, Will didn't mind a saddle blanket at all. As a matter of fact, he really liked it. So she'd climb up on the fence, and she'd get the blanket, and she'd put it on his back, and Will wouldn't give her no trouble. But do you know Will didn't like saddles? And so as soon as she got the saddle and came over to the fence and tried to put it on him, he'd start doing this. And he'd bray, hee-haw! Just like that, don't you see? And he wouldn't stand still for her, no sirree. Well, Miss Grundy would try and slap his back end, or she'd try and kick him, but it never did no good. And she'd get mad. She'd be furious. She'd look at Will like this. You ever been mad like that? Well, and the thing was, it always seemed like Will was laughing at her when he brayed. Hee-haw!